share with us the current progressions of the QSAP. Mr. Laik Hussain.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, good afternoon, and of course glad to see you all once again on this great forum. First of all, I would like to thank PAD and CDA for providing their support for today's webinar from our UAE session. As you all know, Alhamdulillah, we almost defeated the pandemic and our social life is gradually getting better. The Gulf countries are normalizing and easing physical activities all over the Gulf countries. So we QSAP are also planning to restart our physical CPDs because it's been a long time we have not made, because we are frequently arranging webinars, but due to this pandemic issues, we were unable to arrange physical CPD events. So, however, we understand that the benefits of the webinar are broader, because if someone is sitting, like for example, I'm sitting in Saudi Arabia at the moment and I'm going to listen to Faisal Saab webinar. And so likewise, you gentlemen are sitting so many places in the Middle East countries and Pakistan and different part of the world and getting benefit of today's webinar. So, but anyway, for that reason, we will request you that we will share our feedback form by the end of the session, and we request you that provides your feedback, and accordingly, we will arrange the next our either webinar or CPD in UAE or in other Middle East countries. So, with this, I will hand over mic to Rana Saab, and I'm sure that today's topic will enhance your knowledge about project life cycle from contractual perspective. Thank you so much, Rana Saab. Over to you.
Thank you very much, sir, for your kind words. Okay, before I introduce the honorable speaker, I would like to seek your kind attention on the 3 points. Number one, for better handling of the question answer session, it is decided to take all the questions in the chat room during the presentation. So please write up your questions directly in the chat room. The key questions will be answered within allocated time of 10 minutes at the end of the presentation. Rest of the question will be compiled, shared along with the presentation. Now, point number 2, please keep your mic and cameras off during the presentation to avoid any disturbance. And point number 3, that at the end of the presentation, I will make an announcement to please turn on your cameras for a group photo. Thank you for your patience with me. Now allow me to introduce the honorable speaker, Mr. Mohammad Faisal Chaudhry. As most of us will know that Mr. Faisal is the founding member and the president of the QSAP UAE chapter. Mr. Faisal is a quantity surveyor working as a director and has 30 years of industry experience in the field of contracts, commercial, claims management, and quantity surveying in a built environment. Mr. Faisal invested his professional life in the UAE and Pakistan and has acted at different players in the construction arena, including contractors, supervision consultants, the project management consultant. His experience primarily focus on the post-contract administration of remired, lump sum, and cost-plus contracts. His key skills include effective management of claims, disputes, and providing sound advice on dispute resolution and witness statements at arbitration. We are privileged today to learn from him about the project lifecycle from a contractual perspective. So let us warmly welcome Mr. Faisal Chaudhry.
Thanks, Rana Saab, for the introduction, and good evening and Assalamu alaikum everyone. First of all, Irfan Saab or Rana Saab, can you please hear me and see the presentation?
Yes, sir, you are viewable and you are crystal clear.
Okay, thank you very much then. Thank you. So, look, today we will have a look. It means that a project, first of all, we'll see what is the project. Though we daily use the word, I think every day in our practical life, we use the word project. But we will have a look that what is called or how is defined in a contractual way. And then what are the different phases through which a project passes through. But again, we will not look today from a technical perspective because we all look at the things from different perspectives. So today we will look from a contractual and commercial perspective. So first, let's see what is a project before we talk about its different phases. So this is the definition that how project is defined by Project Management Institute. So according to PMI, they define the project as a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. So as you can see, to me, there are two important elements in this definition, which I have highlighted in red. So one is the temporary and the second is unique. And then just have a deep look into it. So in temporary, a project is temporary in the sense that it has a defined beginning and end in time, and therefore it requires defined scope and resources. So we all know any project we work on, it has a start date or end date. So it's a in that sense, it's a temporary endeavor. And then the other element of this definition, unique, how is it unique? So it is a unique in the sense that it is not a routine operation. If you see, for example, any two projects, though they look very similar, even take the simple example of infrastructure, for example, maybe the two projects, they look very similar, but I think in reality they are not. For example, look at the ground investigation, underground services, utilities. The thing which you experience on one project, it will differ on the other one. So it's really a unique endeavor in that sense. But it is a specific set of operations designed to accomplish a singular goal. And then, as I said in the beginning, that today really we will not look at it from a technical perspective. Our focus will be on the contractual or the commercial perspective. And we all know that in the Middle East and in Pakistan, in this part of the region, the form of contract which is commonly used is FIDC. So therefore, in my rest through of the presentation, my reference will be to FIDC. Interestingly, in the FIDC defines certain words and terms, and any term which is defined in the FIDC, then we have to take the defined meanings. So let's first look at whether it is defined. So the FIDC does not define this word project. And then interestingly, in fact, the word project does not appear whether it is a 72 clauses of 1987 edition or 19 clauses of 1999 edition or 21 clauses of 2017 edition. So this is interesting that the FIDC is basically intended to administer a project. We use the word daily in our life, but you will not see this word within FIDC. So if the word project is not used, then the question comes up, what is the term which is used? So instead of using the word project, what FIDC uses is the word works. And then according to clause 1.2, which is basically definitions and interpretation of FIDC 2017, execute the works or execution of the works means the construction and completion of the works and remedying of any defects. So basically this is what you will commonly see in FIDC, that it is the works basically which is how the FIDC use. Now after having a look at the project, then see what are the key phases of a project. So here you see, these are the four key phases through which a project passes in contractual sense. The first one is the tender period. The second one is the completion period. So I use the word completion because whether say construction, but some contracts because they are design and construction, so really not construction, so it's a completion period. Then you have the defects notification period, which commonly used as defects liability or the DLP, and then you have the last phase, which is the legal liability period post completion. So once the project is complete, then you have the legal liability period. And then we will now look at each in bit more detail. So this is the timelines, the start and end of each phase. So let's first look at the tender period. So tender period, it commences when each tenderer can obtain a tender dossier. So basically tender dossiers, mean a set of the documents which mainly comprises drawings, specification, BOQ, instruction to tenders, etc. So that is the called tender dossier. So when a tender can obtain it, and then this period expires on the latest date for submission of the tender. The latest date when it reaches, that period expires. And then look at the completion period. So from a timeline perspective, completion period starts to run from the commencement date. So basically when the project is going to commence, or works are supposed to commence, and then this period ends on the date when the works are completed as certified in the taking over certificate. So again, I have highlighted the word which you should take note on. We talk about the different dates, but it is the date which is set out in the taking over certificate. Once that is issued, then this completion period is over. And look at defects notification period. So this is a specified period. Generally, this period is specified in the contract, and usually it is a 1 year. And sometime, depending upon the, for example, the MEP works, it may goes 2 to 3 years. But generally, it is a 1 year period. It is for notifying defects. Please, can someone off the mic? Okay, so this is the defects notification period. It is the period for notifying defects in the works or a section of any works with any extension. We will be talk about in the later that it can be extended. Now this starts to run from the date on which the works or section is completed, certified in the TOC. So that is the date. From the date in this, it starts to run from that. And then we have legal liability period post completion. So this is basically a period as per the applicable law. This depends upon the jurisdiction. So each is basically most relevant to law than the contract. Once the works are complete, and during which the contractor remains liable for the consequences of any defects in the works. So this is a more dealing with the legal liability than the contractual one. Now after having a look at the timeline, let's look at the key point, which should be key commercial point, which should be considered in each phase. So first tender period. So the key note is the tender dossier should be reviewed prior to issue to prospective tenderers and should be ensured that all documents contained in the dossier, they are consistent. So for example, the spec or the drawings, that there should be, before issuing, so we need to ensure that there's no inconsistency. And then parties' rights and obligations. So basically parties we are talking about here, the contractor and the employees. So their rights and obligation, they should be stated in a clear manner and not in such a way that you need to apply a judgment or opinion to application. To understand it, you don't need to opinion. It should be straightforward, clear. And then, so that was for the issue like on the employer side or its consultant. Now for the tenderer who received the tender dossier, they should scrutinize the tender dossier and give notices to the engineer or employer within the specified time scale. And generally it is as per the example form of instruction to tenderers. This period is 28 days before the tender submission date. So before the tender submission date, 28 days before the tender should any queries, he should send it if any clarification required. And then the engineer or the employee's response to tender notices should be issued. The key thing is it should be issued to all tenderers and it should not give any indication of identity who requested clarification. So it should go to all without the identification who raised it. And then as a result of the requested clarifications, if any amendments need to be made to the tender dossier, as a result of this notice, then the engineer or the employer should issue an addendum to the tender documents. And then each tenderer, it should submit a tender security in the form which is generally specified in the instruction to tenderers, and it should be valid for the stipulated time after the date on which the validity of the tender expired. So that is the expiry date, and again, as per the FIDIC example form of instruction to tenderer, that is the 35 days. And then a tender security is returned by the employer upon the occurrence of any of the following events. The first one, when the employer receives the performance security from the successful tenderer. So if the employer decides to award the project to a particular contractor, then once that he receives the performance security, it will expire, or the employer abandons its intention to appoint a contractor. For example, employer changes its mind not to go with that project, or the validity of all tender securities for the contract expires. And the other key point is the tender, it remains valid and open for acceptance by the employer for the specified period from the tender submission date. And again, that period is as per FIDIC example form of instruction to tender is 145 days. So the date the contractor tender submit, it will remain valid for 140 days. Now, employer, it has the right, it may reject any or all tenders. And after receiving the employer's letter of acceptance, so once the employer accepts a tender and issue letter of acceptance, then the successful tenderer should submit a performance security in accordance with the conditions of contract. So once the letter of acceptance gone, the first thing is the performance security should be issued. And subsequent to receiving the performance security from the successful tenderer, other tenderers who have been unsuccessful, they should be notified that their tenders have been unsuccessful. So that was very much about the tender period, which is generally also in the short. And now we will talk about the completion period, which in our practical life also you experience that completion period is the one which is take longer time. So basically, this is the period when the parties sign the contract and then it starts. So contract becomes effective when the employer issues either the letter of acceptance to the contractor or when the parties sign the contract agreement. So this is, as you can see in the picture, when the parties shake hands. So then it means from there the contract starts. And this is another, we commonly use the term that post-contract. So post-contract means after signing the contract, this period kicks off. So the first thing in the completion period, as I just said before, is the performance security. So the contractor has to provide performance security for proper performance, and it should be within 28 days of receiving the letter of acceptance or signing the contract agreement. So since, again, as I said, we all are from the contractual background, so first thing need to be done is the performance security. And then the performance security, it should be valid until the works are complete and the defects have been rectified. So it should be until the basically expiry of the defects notification period. And remember that the date should not be mentioned in the performance security, because whatever time for completion is, it may get extended. And therefore, if you have a date in the performance security, it may expire. So please make sure that it's not the dates in the performance, but it should be linked with the TOC and the expiry of the defects notification period. And then provision of the performance security to the employer, it is a condition precedent for issuing an interim payment certificate by the engineer. So the contract administrator who are working with consultants or the engineers, they should keep it note that if the performance security is not in place, the interim payment certificate should not be issued. And then typically, this performance security are classified into two types. which basically reflect the conflicting desire or interest of the parties. The first one is called unconditional, or it is called on demand. So basically it means that it can be called on demand without any preconditions, mean any proof of default by the contractor. It's the employer don't need to provide a proof that there is a default by the contractor. It's a just on demand. And then the second one, so first one is the one which basically employers prefer to have, and the second one is a conditional security. So it requires certain conditions like arbitral award or proof of default by the contractor to be specified before it may be called. And this is the one basically which contractors prefer to have, but it depends upon the bargaining and negotiation between the parties at the time of signing the contract. So after performance security, then the second document, which is the important one, is the insurance. So insurance, it generally protects both parties from the financial consequences of any unexpected loss, damage, or liability. So it basically protects the contractor and the employer both. And typically, insurances are obtained by the contractor, meaning a contractor is the one who has to procure it. However, sometimes where the employer, like on a development, it has a number of contracts, then it makes business sense that the employer obtain it to have an economy of scales. And then of course there will be no duplication. For example, if one development, let's say 5 contractors are working, and if we require the contractor to have, then every contractor will get, and certain insurances will be duplication, so which will be basically really waste of money. So in that case, it will be good if employer can take. And generally, employer does take the works insurance. And I would just like to highlight, I think maybe some of you know that QSAP had already delivered an exclusive webinar on the details of insurances. Therefore, I will not go into the details of it. And the relevant insuring party, so the party who is responsible for insuring, should provide the other party within the specified times, which is basically calculated from the commencement date or the start date, copies of the insurances policies and evidence of effective insurances as well as payment of premiums. They should provide it. Even if employer take it, then employer should provide to the contractor and vice versa. And if the insuring party fails to effect and keep in force any of the specified insurances, or it fails to provide satisfactory evidence and copies of policy, then the other party, it may affect the insurance and pay the premiums, and then it can back charge to the other party who is responsible. So keep it, note it again that these documents should be submitted. Now we will talk about money. So we all are basically commercial guys. Let's talk about the contract price. So first thing means we need to look at in the document what type of contract. Is it a remeasured contract or it's a lump sum contract? If it is a remeasurement contract, then the contract price is not fixed, and it is agreed or determined in accordance with the measurement provision as the contract proceeds. So it's basically the contract price is flexible and it keep varies as the contract proceeds, depending upon the actual measurements. However, if it is a lump sum contract, then contract price is the same, means as the lump sum accepted contract amount. So as it is in the contract, that price is locked. However, under both contracts, whether lump sum or remeasured, the contract price is subject to adjustments in accordance with the contract, mainly variations. So if there is a change in the scope, then whether lump sum or remeasurement, it is subject to the positive or the negative impact on it. And the accepted contract amount must be distinguished from the contract price. So this should be noted that the accepted contract amount is the one which is stated in the contract. It's a locked, it doesn't change, whereas the contract price is not a fixed number, it keeps changing throughout the duration of the project. The accepted contract amount, as I said, is a fix, but the contract price will change as a result of variations and other adjustments. So other adjustment means like claims or other things. Now we will talk about payments, and first we will talk about interim payment certificates. So contractor should submit a statement. Statement is the word which is used in FIDEC, which we typically say application for interim payment certificate to the engineer every month in the previously approved form. And then each statement or application should be accompanied, or it can be preceded by supporting documents like progress reports and the other measurement sheets taking account of the financial provisions. It varies depending upon whether it's a remeasurement or lump sum. And unless and until the contractor submits its application, progress report, and other necessary supporting documents, the period within which is to be made does not commence. So this is the important thing for to note, that until the statement is submitted, the employer has the obligation to pay it. That period does not start to commence. But however, we should take note that clause 14.6 of FIDEC 99 Red Book, it does not permit certification or payment to be withheld if the contractor has not provided the appropriate documents in support of parts of its submission. So key thing is that one thing is a statement. I mean, if the statement is not there or the supporting papers are not there, then the period will not start. However, if the statement is provided but any part of it's not supported, then the interim payment certificate should not be withheld. It should be issued. Now, in these circumstances, for example, where the contractor submit the application, but some of the supporting documents are not there, then the engineer should immediately request prompt submission of the appropriate supporting documents from the contractor. And unless it is submitted promptly, certification or payment should then proceed, excluding the item for which such documents are not submitted. So if, for example, this payment application comes in, if some documents are missing, the engineer should request it, and if it is received, then it should consider, and let's say if it is not received, then they should not withhold the payment, and the engineer should proceed with the certification, and it may exclude the item for which there is no substantiation. So the idea is that the cash flow should not be affected. And then engineer should, within the specified period, which is generally 28 days, after receiving a statement and supporting documents, it should issue to the employer an interim payment certificate, which should state the amount which engineer think is fairly due and payable to the contractor. And then it should be also noted that under FIDEC, a copy of the payment certificate, when the engineer should issue the payment certificate to the employer, it should also issue the copy to the contractor, notifying him that what is his entitlement. And then the employer is required to pay to the contractor the amount as in the interim payment certificate within the specified period, regardless of if the employer may have any entitlement to compensation from any claim which the employer may have. And if employer consider itself entitled that it has any claim against the contractor, then the employer should give notice and particulars to the contractor. So first it should give the notice and particular, then only he will be sorry, I think I was a bit muted. So once the employer issue the notice and the particular, then the employer's entitlement is to be agreed or determined. So basically it's by the engineer that how much deduction should be applied. And the contractor is entitled to financing charges if it does not receive payment within the specified time period. So the FIDEC allows him to claim finance charges. So that was very much about the interim payment certificate. Now we will talk about the statement at completion. So statement and completion is basically once the works are complete, then within it is, I mean, generally it is 84 days after the contractor received the taking over certificate. Then the contractor is required to submit to the engineer a statement at completion. So that is called statement. The works are complete, and then he should submit to the engineer. Here the important point which should be noted is that the time, which is whatever 84 days, it's from the date of receiving the taking over certificate, not from the date stated in the taking over certificate. So these are two different dates. Mean the taking over certificate basically say the works are complete on this date, but but it takes time. Taking over tax certificate may be issued 2 months after the actual completion. So there are the key elements which must be included in the statement at completion. The first thing is a value of all work done in accordance with the contract up to the date stated in the taking over certificate. So whatever work done up to that date, the value should be there. Second thing, any further sum like any claims which the contractor considers are due, that should be included. And the third important thing, as you can see, which is highlighted in red, it is an estimate. It's not actual number, but an estimate of any other amounts, and which should be shown separately, which the contractor considers that he will become due under the contract in the future. So intention is the works have been completed, so the client want to know what is his exposure or what contractor is thinking about any future claims. So that must be there. And then once the statement at completion is submitted, the engineer should process it like any other interim payment certificate or statements. So there is no different way of treating it. And the important thing here is that according to FIDIC 99 Red Book, the employer shall have no liability to the contractor except to the extent that the contractor has included an amount expressly for that matter in the statement at completion, other than the matter arising from the issue of the TOC. So as we said before, that the whatever is in the statement at the completion, that will be the liability of the, if something is not in the statement at completion, that employer will be no liable for it. And then there is an exception that if anything that takes after the TOC, of course, that cannot be included in the statement at completion. Now let's look at the taking over of the works and section, because this is an area which generally typically contractually looked at, and different of basically opinions also, or let's say difference of opinions appear on this. So taking over by the employer, it should take place when the works are a section, I mean if the contract defined any section, so these are it happen when the works or section pass the test on completion. So that's the prerequisite. The works are substantially complete. So this here is a, let's say, basically a judgmental thing, that when you think the works are complete, maybe one party thinks the works are complete. Does it mean works should be 100% complete? Mean every single piece of, let's say, a paint or a finish should be done? So the answer is no. It's a substantially, and generally meaning of substantial completion is that the works can be used for the purpose they are intended for. So if the employer can make, let's say, the beneficiary use of the works, so any cosmetic things are incomplete, that should not affect the issue of the TOC. And then any contractual requirements relating to taking over certificates have been met. So apart from the completion, the physical works, there are contractual requirements like warranties, like there are as-built drawings. So all those requirements should be met. And then the TOC has been issued or is deemed to have been issued. So once the TOC issued, the employer should take over. Or let's say if the TOC should have been issued, but for certain reason it's not issued, then FIDIC allows that it will be deemed issued, and there are certain conditions attached to it. So the process is the contractor applies for the taking over certificate by giving a notice up to 14 days before when it expects that the completion of the works or a section is achieved, and then within 28 days of receiving the contractor's application for taking over certificate, engineer, he is obliged to either issue the taking over certificate, and he should state the date on which it believes that the works are complete, or if he thinks no, the works are not substantially complete or the requirements are not met, then it should reject the application, and in his rejection he should specify what are the works need to be done before the TOC to be issued. And here, which I said before, the deemed issue, I mean, if the engineer fails, so when I use the word fail, it means, sorry, engineer, it means either a consultant on the part of the, on the behalf of the employer. So if engineer fails to issue the TOC or reject the application within the period, I mean, either fail to issue or reject application within the period of 28 days, and if the works are substantially complete in accordance with the contract, then the TOC shall be deemed to have been issued on the last day of that period. So this period is very important, and the application when it comes in, it should be responded to. And there are two ways, either reject it or issue the TOC. So now, before I talk about the taking over of the works or section, let's have a quick look of parts of the works. So a part is basically which is not defined, there's no specific section. Any part of the work or any element of the works can constitute a part. And according to clause 10.2 of FIDIC 99 Red Book, the engineer may, at its sole discretion of the employer, issue a TOC for any part of the permanent works. Unless a TOC is issued, so this is another important thing, that if, let's say, for there could be certain reason that the employer changes its mind, it want to use it part of the works for whatever reasons, then it is only, he should first issue the TOC, then he can use the works. And unless the TOC is issued, the employer shall not use a part of the works, except, and then there are certain exceptions, like it's a temporary measure, which is either specified in the contract or agreed. So basically the key thing is it should be agreed or specified, and then the first employer should issue the TOC for that employer, and then he can use it. And however, if the employer does use any part of the works before the TOC is issued, if it does use it, then that part which employer used shall be deemed to have been taken over from the date it is used, and the contractor is basically ceases to be liable for the care of that part of the work, and the engineer is required to issue a TOC for that part if it's requested by the contractor. And once it's done, the delay damages are reduced. So the delay damages mean for the delay are reduced by a proportional amount to the value of the work taken over. Now let's look at what is the significance of taking over certificate for a contract administrator or a QS. So first, in relation to the dates of its issue, as I said before, there are two key dates which should be taken account of. First is the date, which is when the TOC is issued, when the contractor receives the taking over certificate, and the second is the date, which is stated in the taking over certificate showing when the works are complete. So first talk about the date of issuing the TOC. So the responsibility for the care of the works, now it passes from the contractor to the employer. Contractor is no more responsible for care. And then the contractor's obligation to ensure of the whole of the works ends. He may remain responsible for a part, but not for the whole. And first half of the retention money is released. And lastly, time begins to run for the statement at completion. As I said before, once the TOC is issued, the contractor is obliged to submit the statement at completion. The 84 days will start to run from that day. And second significance, in relation to the date of substantial completion as set out in the taking over certificate. So means from that date, the delay damages cease to apply, and then the defects notification period starts to run from that date. So after having talked about the completion period, of course, I captured the key elements, keeping in view our the limited time, which is we will try to complete in 1 hour. So we will now talk about the defects notification period. So a significant change in the contractual procedure occurs during the defects notification period. So you note the key, for example, the engineer's role is reduced, and the employer takes over direct responsibility for the notification of defects. So for example, depending upon the type of project or works, like if it is a building, so the employer is now using, it's a team basically using the buildings, so he's become more responsible than the engineer. And the reason for that, this is that the employer will now have possession of the works. So remember that previously possession of the sites sits with the contractor, and now the possession of the works, it passes to the employer, and employer is the one who will be aware of any defects in the works. And the contractor will also need to liaise with the employer in order to gain access to remedy any defects. So before any party, any stakeholder, during the completion period, if need access, and then it should be basically the contractor on the access. However, during the defects notification period, it passes on to the employer. And then during the defects notification period, the engineer no longer has the power to instruct variations. As clause 13.1 of FIDIC 99 Red Book, it categorically states that variation may be initiated by the engineer at any time prior to issue to the taking over certificate. So this is generally I am talking about the FIDIC standard conditions. However, please take note that as you see, I think in this part of the world, generally there are amendments. So take note of the amendments which are the particular conditions, because in some contracts I have seen that they change to the performance certificate. So now the key thing is during the defects notification period, what is the contractor responsibility in that phase? So the first thing is contractor is required to complete any work which is outstanding at the time of taking over certificate. As I said before, at the time of the TOC, work does not necessarily need to be 100% complete. Any minor items of the works or cosmetic things can still be outstanding. So now those outstanding things need to be completed during the, I will say, early phase of the defects notification period, and that means a reasonable time, and the generally engineer instruct it. And the second thing is the contractor should carry out all work to rectify any defects or any damage, and which should be notified either by the employer or on behalf of the employer or the engineer, and that should be done before the expiry dates of the defects notification period. And then any defect or damage notified during the defects notification period, they are required to be rectified by the contractor at its cost, provided that such rectification work is attributable to any design for which the contractor is responsible, or the plant, materials or workmanship which is not in accordance with the contract, or failure by the contractor to comply with any other obligation. If these conditions apply, then the contractor should do it at its own risk and cost. Other defects that are notified are subject to variation procedure. For example, if any, let's say, damage occur to the works during the operation of the works by the employer, then surely contractor is not responsible for it. He should be entitled to cost for it. So the variation provision will apply. Another important element is the extension of the defects notification period. So as I said before, it's a generally 1 year defects notification period. However, under certain circumstances, it can be extended. And clause 11.3 of FIDIC 99 Red Book, it allows the extension of the defects notification period if a defect or damage prevent the works, section, or a major of item from its operating. And so if the works, section, or any major item of plant cannot be operated for a certain number of days, then the employer is entitled under clause 2.5 of FIDEC 99 Red Book to require the defects notification period to be extended by that number of days. However, this is another important point which the contract administrator should note, that according to clause 2.5 of FIDEC 99 Red Book, in notice relating to extension of the defects notification period, it need to be given before the expiry of that period. So it cannot be done after that. And if the contractor is not responsible for the defect or damage, then that rectification work would constitute a variation, and it would entitle the contractor to additional payment, and including any compensation for the extension of that defects notification period, unless the employer, he waives its entitlement to extension. He say, okay, he doesn't want to extend it. And the maximum it can be extended is 2 years under FIDEC. It cannot be done more than 2 years. However, under certain contracts, as I said, in the particular condition, I have seen it going up to 4 years, which is, I don't, maybe for it is for, like, let's say for any major plant related projects. So the last thing, if you will see in the defects notification period, is the performance certificate. So performance certificates, it provide written confirmation that the contractor has completed its all obligation, and this document basically constitute acceptance of the works. It's an important document, and it's because it's linked to certain things. For example, the first thing is a employer's obligation to return the performance security. So which we said in my beginning of my presentation, the performance security, which is the first thing which the contractor is supposed to provide. Now that is required to be returned within 21 days after receiving the performance certificate. And then the contractor's right of access to the site is also linked with it. And then obligation on the contractor to issue the draft final statement. So as I said before, I mean the taking over certificate once issued, then the contractor has to submit the statement and completion. And once the performance certificate is issued, then the contractor has to issue the draft final statement. And you note that throughout the project life cycle, this is the only statement which is contractor required, the draft final statement. And we will talk about in a while why. And then the sum of the contractor's insurance obligation are linked with the performance certificate. And it should be issued within 28 days after the latest of the expiry dates of the defects notification period, or as soon as thereafter. So latest, the word is used here. A project may have more than one defects notification period. For example, maybe having for the sections. So performance certificate is linked to the latest of them. And the contractor has supplied all the contractor's documents, and it has completed and tested all the works or rectified any defects. And this is the last thing from a commercial perspective, final statement. So within 56 days after receiving the performance certificate, the contractor, it must submit the engineer a draft final statement with supporting documents. The draft final statement, it should show, number one, the value of work done in accordance with the contract, and any further sum which the contractor considered to be due, like claims. Now after reviewing it, if the engineer disagree with or cannot verify any part of the final statement, then the contractor is required to provide further information as the engineer reasonably required and make such changes in the draft. So whatever the changes are required, the key thing is the final statement should be agreed. And then the contractor must prepare and submit to the engineer the final statement as agreed. So this word agreed only appear in the final statement. For other statements, there's a no need agreement. The contractor can submit whatever he thinks he's entitled to, and the engineer should issue the certificate whatever engineer reasonably believe the contractor entitlement is. And the idea behind that is that the cash flow is the timing of the cash flow is important. Cash flow should not be disrupted, because otherwise that will affect the project. However, there is a possibility that after discussion between the engineer and the contractor, and if it becomes evident that there is a dispute, I mean the engineer and the contractor cannot agree, then the engineer must deliver to the employer with a copy to the contractor an interim payment certificate. So it will not be a final. Engineer can issue an interim payment certificate for the agreed parts of the draft final statement. And the draft final statement remains open until the dispute is finally resolved under clauses 20.4, which is basically dispute adjudication board, or 20.5, which is the amicable settlement. So until that time the dispute is resolved, draft final statement will remain open. And if the dispute is resolved under clause 24 or 5, then the contractor will prepare and submit to the employer with a copy to the engineer a final statement in accordance with the outcome. So whatever outcome of the dispute will be, maybe at that time this process generally takes longer. Maybe engineer is no more there. That's why at that time the contractor will submit to the employer, not the engineer, but he should copy to the engineer. And with the final statement, the contractor must submit a written discharge, in which he should confirm that the final statement represents the full and final settlement of all monies due to the contractor in connection with the contract. And then within 28 days after receiving the final statement and written discharge, the engineer should issue to the employer the final payment certificate. And the final payment certificate must state two things. First thing, the amount which is finally due. So this is the final payment, and the balance, if any, due from the employer to the contractor, or from the contractor to the employer, after giving credit to the employer for all amounts previously paid by the employer and all sums to which the employer is entitled. So there's a possibility, maybe if, let's say, if there is any overpayment, so it should be a payment either from the employer to the contractor or vice versa. And now the other important thing is that if the contractor, let's say, fails to apply for a final payment certificate under the contract, then the engineer will issue the final payment certificate for such amount as it's fairly determined to be due. So there could be a possibility, let's say, through interim payments, if the contractor has received all the money due, and maybe it's an amount due from the contractor to the employer. So in that scenario, contractor may not submit the final payment. Don't apply. So in that case, the engineer, the contract give the rights to the engineer to take initiative and raise the final payment certificate. With this, so our defects notification period ends, and the last phase, which is basically legal liability, and after issue of the performance certificate phase. So as I said in the beginning of the presentation, this is very much related to the legal, I would say, the implications of wherever the contract is in place. So despite the issue of the performance certificate, the contractor remains liable for any latent defects under the applicable laws of the country in which the works are being carried out. For example, here in the UAE, there is a decennial liability. So basically, as per the UAE Civil Code, and it is a strict joint liability of the contractor and the engineer for a period of 10 years from the date of delivery of the works or a completion of the works for any defects in building that threaten the stability of the building. So depending upon it's whether a defect due to the construction, or if it is a defect due to the design. So there is a liability, joint liability by the contractor and engineer for a period of 10 years. So with this, that's it, gentlemen. And thank you very much for attending today's event. So Irfan Saab, I hope that I completed within the time you allowed me.
Thank you very much, Faisal Saab. Yes, exactly. Now there is a question answer session. Rana sir, please take care.
Thank you, Mr. Mohammad Faisal, for providing knowledge and upgrading our understanding on the topic of inestimable worth. Now, Mr. Mohammad Faisal Chaudhary and Mr. Mahmood Iqbal will further guide us on the topic by answering our questions. Mr. Faisal and Mr. Mahmood. Mr. Mahmood, are you hearing us? Maybe some issue with Mr. Mahmood. So with your permission, sir.
It could be
If I can ask the first question.
Yeah, sure, please. Go ahead, Rana Saab.
Okay, the question number 1 is, advance payment can be issued prior to performance security?
I would say no. Generally, it is linked with the performance security. It's very much depending upon the terms, which is it is a good question, I think, from a QS and the contract administrator perspective. So generally, in the contract, it is a set out that what are the requirements for the advance payment certificate. And I think one of the performance security, it is one of the requirement.
Okay, sir. Thank you. And the question number 2 is, how much retention money can be released at statement at completion?
Okay. So as I said in the beginning, I think that there are two things. So under the contract, so once the taking over certificate is issued, then half of the retention money can be released to the contractor.
Okay. And the third question is, should the statement at completion include the amount of claim in dispute resolution?
So as I said, it is a basically mandatory that when the contractor submit the statement at completion, so it identifies, okay, this is the value of work which is done. And the second thing, these are the claims, for example, which the contractor consider whether it's in a dispute resolution or whether contractor believes that it is entitled to, that should be there. And then the third thing should be any estimate of the claims, I mean, whatever he think they are. So it should be in the statement at completion. And however, when the time of for the certification purpose, because the employer want to know what could be his exposure at the completion of the project. But however, for the engineer, when it has to certify, engineer will certify in accordance with normal other payment certificates. So for example, whatever engineer believes, for example, if claims are assessed, so he can certify. And if they are still in the process and he believes it's not entitled to, then surely he is not going to certify it.
So thank you. And the question number 4 is, could you explain what activities are included in inception phase of the project?
Sorry again, I think voice is a bit not clear. Can you please repeat the question?
Yes, sure. Could you please explain what activities are included in inception phase of the project? Inception phase of the project.
In inception, so mean in the early stage of the project.
Absolutely.
So including where? I did not get. I mean, activities mean either it's a question is in relation to what activities contractor should carry out, or it is from a commercial perspective that what activities QS should be doing.
Yeah, QS in general, that what activities the QS should undertake at the beginning of the inception phase of the project.
All right. So I think the first thing is he need to look at like the securities, for example, the performance securities in place, insurances. These comes in the beginning of the project. So either if it is a contractor QS, he need to look at the requirements, who is responsible for taking the insurances. Because I have seen on certain project, it's the employer is responsible, especially for the construction risk. He takes it, or in somewhere in the contractor. So who is responsible? If contractor is responsible, so he should take and pass the copies to the engineer. And if, for example, employer is responsible, then really contractor should ask the employer to provide the copies. And then he should, as you said, the advance payment. That is the first thing. Once the in the contract, whatever the prerequisites that is done, then they should prepare the advance payment certificate. And the other thing is, the FIDIC requires that the interim payment certificate should be submitted in the form of, which is acceptable to the engineer. So basically, both QSs should sit together, agree on the form of the interim payment certificate, application, or the measurements and other things, and then breakdowns of the, for example, lump sum item, how they are going to be. So they should be busy on agreeing on the breakdowns of all those items, which are the lump sums.
Thank you very much, sir. Fair enough. If the contractor is required to keep insurances for the defects liability period also?
It's a good question. So first of all, the insurance should be there. Full insurances should be there until the taking over certificates, and then the responsibility in relation to insurances, it does not end, but it get reduced. It reduces in the context of, let's say, whatever the works, as I said, at the time of taking over certificate, certain works, generally we have seen it remains outstanding, and which is acceptable also, which contractor need to do complete it. So contractor is responsible for insurance in relation to completion of those works, and then the contractor is also responsible for any defects that may appear during the DNP, and then insurance in relation to that maintaining the defects, yes, it should be there. So it's a responsibility is there, but it is reduced.
The second last question for you is that can you please elaborate the liquidated damages and its effect on price adjustment?
Right, yeah. So liquidated damages basically are, let's say, in principle, it should be a assessment which the employer should do, taking into account of his, he may have some commitments or the obligation depending upon the type of the projects, that if project get delayed, how much losses he is going to incur. So he basically then put that a reasonable assessment of that amount, so that if job get delayed, the both parties are aware of, the contractor is aware how much is his liability in the event there is a delay, and the employer is also basically, he also is somehow covered, that in the case of delay his losses will be covered. And then definitely the contractor, when he will price the job, he will also look at that depending upon the amount of the delay damages, it will affect his price. So he will price that risk in his pricing. So it is a direct, it's linked with the amount of delay damages anyway is linked with the contract price.
Thank you, sir. If Mr. Mahmood is there, if Mr. Mahmood can hear us, I think still missing. So one last question from you, sir, today. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your effort and the way you are guiding us. We are really obliged. So one last question for today. Should the written discharge be signed by the contracting parties to relieve both from any obligations?
So I think the first, Rana Sahab, before answering this question, I mean, what you mentioned about me, I would say it's a platform where we learn from each other. It is not something, I think we all have different knowledge, and this is a platform where we can get benefit from each other's experience. I really learn from all of you. So it's my pleasure. And really it's a qsap who has provided this platform. Now coming to the point on the discharge. So discharge is a basically certificate which should be submitted with the final statement. So it's a basically to avoid, and it should be, yes, signed by the, let's say, the authorized representative of the contractor who has the delegation of authority, and it basically confirms that the amount, the final account has been settled. So I mean, to avoid any doubt in the future that there's a no outstanding liability from other side. Basically it's from the contractor to the employer.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Thanks a lot for all this effort you have made for us, and you have educated us today on the contractual matters. Now, I would like to request all the attendees if they can please turn on their cameras so that we can have a group photo, if possible. You may mute your mics, but you can on your cameras. If you all please on your cameras, we would love to take a photograph so that we can share it on various mediums.
Rana sahab, Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Actually, I have one question I need to ask to Faisal bhai.
Sure.
Faisal bhai, my question is there, just we were talking about the decennial liability. As per the discussion, it seemed that when the defects notification period finished, the decennial liability starts as per the UAE Civil Code law. My question is there, if something happened within that period, who will do the validation of the damages? It is part of the contractor responsibility to make an assessment about the damages, or it is part of the employer's liability to make a claim about the damages happened because of this structural damages or whatever you can say damages happened in the period of decennial liability.
So yeah, good question. So first of all, I think as I said before, it's a very much legally oriented obligation. So it's and definitely my background is not from the law. What the wording I have seen, it says from the delivery of the works. Now what that means, delivery, does it means from the taking over certificate which we use the term, or does it mean from the expiry of the defects notification period? In some contract I have seen it has been defined. It says from the issue of the performance certificate. If it is not there, it's open to legal interpretation. Second thing, the obligation. Again, it's not a straightforward thing. Depending upon what is it need to be investigated, that what was the, let's say, defect, who was responsible for it. It would not be a straightforward. I think there's some sort of the expert's judgment would be required. Contractor would generally say, okay, I have done the workmanship, it is down to the designer will say no. So I think there is a sort of some due diligence will be carried out, but we need to determine first who is the responsible for it, and then accordingly liability can be imposed, whoever party becomes liable for it.
Okay, thank you, Faisal. Thank you.
Welcome, sir. Welcome.
So, thank you once again, all of you, for sparing your valuable time and attending this webinar. Soon you will be receiving a flyer of the upcoming webinar. Until then, I would say thank you, goodbye, and Allah Hafiz.
Can you forward the recording?
Yes, the recording will be shared.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure seeing all of you.